Buenos días.
Good morning to you all. We continue with this second day of the doctoral seminar, Peace and European Values as a Potential Model for Integration and Progress in a Global World. We have a small change in the program. We have with us Professor Sofia Corradi. She will be there in the front line, listening attentively, and she passes her notes on what has to be taken into account in the different papers, but we're going to continue with our academic program with the presentation of the papers. It will be Delia Manzanero who will present Edith Rodonczi and who will moderate the debate. Delia, you have the floor. Good morning to you all again. We are resuming the second session of the morning. It is for me a great honor and a privilege to introduce you to Professor Edith Rodonczi. She's Director of International Relations in many universities. I couldn't quote all of them. She has also been Director of Programs of Education as important as Erasmus Plus. She's a great and very knowledgeable expert in this kind of education projects. We're going to learn a lot from her lecture. She's going to speak about the role of mobility actions in internationalization of higher education from a European perspective. So, Edith, when you want, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for this highly appreciative introduction. I try my best to meet the expectations, but now the standard is very high. Thank you all for joining the session and for your interest in my presentation. This is a great honor to be here and a special privilege for me personally, because part of my dissertation relates to the work of Sofia, and it's a special privilege to have her here and meet her in person. I never expected that. So thank you, Sofia, for being here with us. I would like to join my fellow grantees in acknowledging the work of the Foundation, making it possible for us to participate in this highly distinctive and unique doctoral seminar. The title of my dissertation is The Role of Mobility in the Internationalization of Higher Education, and part of that is the European perspective. And I would like to share that part with you today. I have a motto for my dissertation, and it goes like that. Internationalization of higher education is one of the ways a country responds to the impact of globalization, yet at the same time respects the individuality of the nation. Thus, globalization can be seen as the catalyst, but internationalization as a response. I like this not very recent definition of internationalization. As you can see, it's from 1969, because it combines the concepts of globalization, internationalization, and the nation-based individuality. Also, it explains, to some extent, the role of globalization and internationalization in relation to each other. So my dissertation is about a couple of topics. First, that I would like to share with you is why I have chosen this topic. What is the importance of investigating international mobility nowadays? I would like to share with you a brief historical overview of the mobility, then tell you about the recent global mobility trends and strategies, then focusing on specifically the mobility strategies in Europe and the Erasmus Program. And most probably I won't have time, but I also include in my dissertation the impact of mobility actions. And I conducted an extensive research, primary research, on the Hungarian public universities regarding their internationalization. And if someone is interested, I'm very happy to share my findings in that respect outside this presentation. I also investigated the relation of internationalization and competitiveness. After all, what is the ultimate goal of internationalization? Why do universities want to internationalize? And one of the answers is that because they want to be competitive. Now, how do you measure the competitiveness of a university? I think this is a big and unsolved question. Currently, we have the university rankings, which we like or dislike. Most of us dislike, but that's the only way we can measure it now. And I investigated the actual weighting of the international dimension when compiling those university rankings. So if we have time, I would be very happy to share like one slide with you, but it depends on the time. Now, to sum it up, regarding the relevance, the importance of the topic is that internationalization in higher education has become a political agenda in our times, and its driving force is international mobility. At the beginning of the 21st century, the overarching target for Europe is integration and competitiveness, as we have discussed it in several of the presentations earlier, at least for the integration part. And education has to contribute in its own role. For the past 3 decades, primarily in higher education, the focus has been shifted towards a demand for internationalization. The concept itself might have undergone some modifications throughout the years, but facilitating and financing internationalization and mobility in the European higher education has to be, and it is, on the agenda. Internationalization has become a defining element in the strategies of higher education institutions and in the educational policies at national and regional levels. And as I have pointed out, the oldest, largest, and most influential international higher education activity is the cross-border mobility. Previously, Dela referred to education as a weapon. I tend to use the word tool because I've found that to be more kind of peaceful, but I might borrow her expression because weapon sounds more powerful in this sense. So education as such is the most direct tool or weapon to open minds and promote the core values of a culture. Through students and faculty exchanges via mobility actions, our academic communities are exposed to a two-directional movement of understanding, sensible sharing, and identifying mutual interest and benefits, which is one of the best roads to achieve the ultimate objective of living in a peaceful world. Currently, there are more than 4 million mobile students in the world, out of the 210 million students currently enrolled in tertiary education. And it is estimated that approximately 1 million faculty and researchers are also on the move. In addition to the intra-European mobility, more than 1 million foreign students study in Europe, in addition to Erasmus and intra-European mobility. Therefore, we have immense opportunities, but also huge responsibilities in sharing European values, culture, and knowledge. And this was the idea that based my PhD studies and research. For the past 1.5 days, so to say, we struggled a lot with definitions. So I'm trying to give you 2 definitions to base the idea on which I followed and which kind of directed my thinking in this area. Regarding globalization, we can say that it's actually started in the economic sphere. And they say it started back in the 16th century with the colonization. It has a long history. And when I started to investigate, I have come across more than 100 different definitions. So it's probably a big challenge to define what globalization is. The most comprehensive, but at the same time, the most general for me was Stephen Albrough's concept, saying that globalization refers to all those processes by which the peoples of the world are incorporated into a single world society that is a global society. In higher education context, it is referred more to as internationalization, and the term comes in only towards the end of the 20th century, in the 1980s. And again, hundreds of attempts to define what we mean by internationalization. I rely on Jane Knight's definition, which is again very generic but very permissive. So you can put a lot of content into it if you wish. Internationalization is the process through which the international, intercultural, and global dimensions are integrated into the objective of higher education. Now, when it comes to internationalization, I would just quickly like to identify a few types. Well, the most important being international mobility, but we talk about building international networks, participating in transnational projects, building up joint degrees, courses, research programs. Altogether, we can speak about the export and import of educational services, and I will return to that. Now, my focus is on mobility amongst the international activities, and I sense that most of you struggled, when it comes to research, we struggle with definition and data, isn't that? So this is the case with mobility, believe it or not, because there are issues around defining mobility. What counts as a mobility? Not long ago, I participated in an international conference in China. I was the only European participant, and one of the rectors of a Chinese university stood up and said, well, we are very supportive of international mobilities. We provide financial support to our students for those who need, and we provide academic support through our international links. So by the time the students complete their university studies, 100% of our students get an international mobility, 100. And I nearly fainted. I wanted to go under the carpet that, okay, what can I tell about Europe now? But luckily enough, I asked him that how long is an international mobility? And he said 2 weeks. And I said, okay, we are fine. 2 weeks is not an international mobility. It's a study visit, right? So, or another aspect, how you define mobility is last night, Mikkel is not here, but we were talking about his children going to a European school in Belgium, in Brussels. Now, they are of Spanish nationality. If they go to university in Brussels, they will appear in the database as an international student, but that they are not mobile students. They don't cross the border. They are not exposed to a new culture, so the essence of the international mobility is lost. So the most significant data providers struggle with that a lot. OECD, UNESCO, World Bank, I used a lot of World Bank data, Project Atlas, they all measure international mobility at a certain time of the year. Now, if it's in one semester and once a year, then all Erasmus mobilities are out. Well, half of them at least, because most of them go for 1 semester, right? So if we measure the mobility in September, no Erasmus mobility would count that is in the 2nd semester. So we have to be careful with the data. This is what I'm trying to say. And what I used in my research was that cross-border, the border needs to be crossed, and it needs to be at least 1 semester long. Now, I would like to call your attention to the fact that all actors of the higher education arena are mobile in the 21st century. People are kind of clear. Students are mobile, researchers, faculty. Thanks to the Erasmus programs, now administrative staff is on the move, so that is clear. But we have to consider that all programs are mobile through franchising. You export whatever you can from your university, all the courses, degree programs, training programs, and also institutions are mobile in the 21st century. Currently, we have more than 300 branch campuses all over the world, so the university go out and establish an institution in a different country, and that is counts as a mobility. Well, I focus on the people mobility. I just wanted to call your attention to that. So focusing on the mobility, let me give you a brief historical overview, starting with the antiquity, and I was very happy to see the previous presenter going back to that much in time. I was a bit concerned about doing the same thing. So in the antiquities, back in the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, in Athens, Pergamon, Ephesus, there were education centers that were kind of attracting students from, and also faculty in that sense, teachers, from faraway state cities back in those days. In the 2nd century before Christ, the literature talks about visiting philosophers, referring to some kind of mobility. In the 1st century in Rome, there were law schools that were actually exported to Berytus, which is Beirut today, just like a branch campus, or almost like a branch campus today. So there are roots there, of course, not in the same sense as mobility today, and there is no genetic relation between those initiatives and what we call mobility today. But it was interesting that there were efforts already at that time. And I put the illustration of Raphael's The School of Athens to illustrate that, as no maps can show where the antique schools were. I consulted archaeologists, and they say we are unable to locate them, but they existed. Now, going on to the Middle Ages, often referred to as the Dark Ages, which is probably true if the English language used that term, but we shouldn't forget that that was the age when when a lot of European universities were established. And I know the map is very small, but there are about 24 of universities on that map, founded in the Middle Ages, still operating today, probably with gaps in the history, but still there and still operating. As long as the universities were established, the phenomenon of the peregrinatio academica, the traveling scholar, appeared on the scene. So the medieval student and scholar mobility can be characterized with small numbers, individual initiatives, often supported by the clergy. The participants were distinguished, highly privileged people with extremely high motivation in their quest for knowledge, because they had to combat long, tiring, often dangerous journeys. If you think of the wars and the plagues and the transportation system of the medieval times. But in spite of all those difficulties, the peregrinatio academica was constantly increasing in numbers throughout the Renaissance and up until the 19th century. Hungary, and I know we are a small country, but let me give this example. Hungary had 9 students in the 12th century registered as a mobility student, as a peregrinatio academica. In the 19th century, we had 45,000, so it was an extreme boom in that. Obviously, in the 19th century, when the national universities started to be formulated and funded, there was a decline in those type of peregrinatio academica activities. But the revival came in the modern times. International mobility was getting considered more wide. Well, the first half of the 20th century, I should go on, I'm sorry. The first half of the 20th century was kind of complicated, as we know, due to the wars which hindered the student mobility. But following the wars, a special impetus was given to student mobility through organized programs. And this is the first time when they actually appeared, as opposed to individual initiatives. The first one, right after the First War, was a German initiative, DAAD, and I don't dare try to pronounce the long name, we all know, DAAD, established in 1925. After the Second World War, we can think about the Fulbright program. Both of those are still alive and actively support students through scholarship schemes. And they were followed by numerous governmental schemes in the various countries. Now, what features the recent global mobility, and I underline global here. When I say recent in this context, I refer to the past 2, rather 3 decades in the history of mobility. So I was able to identify 4 major trends. The first one is massification. As the higher education has been massified, the same phenomenon is reflected in the mobility actions. The second is globalization. It means that basically all regions of the world show a measurable extent of mobility by today. The third one is it's getting scheme-based. This is the reference to the Fulbright, the British Council, and all the others scheme-based scholarship programs. And the fourth trend is a type of business orientation. Higher education started to consider international mobility as a source of income generation. Now, to illustrate massification, please see this chart, and you don't have to see the numbers. It's enough if you see the columns and the lines. The blue columns indicate the total number of students participating in higher education between 1975 and 2014. And what color is that line? Red line, orange line, shows the number of the mobile students. And you can see that it strictly correlates up until the very, very last years. As the numbers in the higher education grow, the number of mobile students grow. This is the global chart, and please try to remember this because we come back to that at one point. Having seen those numbers growing all the time, a couple of predictions were made around the turn of the century. And first, British Council came out with a forecast, and then OECD confirmed that, and they expected to have 8 million students by 2020 first, and then they modified, saying that it's not that rapid altogether to have it by 2025. And I would like to warn a little bit regarding those predictions. If you look at this chart, you can see, again, just the columns and the lines. Don't bother with the numbers. You don't have to see them. So the column shows the number of students participating in tertiary education, and the orange line shows the percentage. the every time percentage of the mobile students. So as you can see, there is an absolute growth in numbers, but there is no relative numbers. In the past 40 years, globally, and again I underline globally, the percentage of students participating in mobilities is around 2%, 1.9 to 2.2 at the highest peak. So there is not that much dynamism on a global level regarding the growth of student mobility. Now, my second statement was about mobility globalizing, and to illustrate that, please see that chart showing the different regions of the world and the inbound, outbound mobilities. And what you can see there, if it's too small, I apologize, that basically all the regions are active in a different way. There are huge imbalances. Western Europe, North America are absolutely host regions. They send a lot less than they receive, while Asia, Africa, Latin America are sending countries on a global level. What I found interesting in that data is the top two lines. You can see the Arab states and Central and Eastern Europe showing quite close to balance, which at first surprised me, and when I started to investigate it, it turned out it's a recent development. So it shows the growth in mobility globally also, and the geographical spread, but those are really recent developments. The Arab states, we know about the money involved, and I was very happy to see my region getting close to a balanced mobility picture. Going a little bit more into the global data, I would like to show you how much the market actually changed in just 15 years. We don't have global data prior to 2001, so I was examining the two years in 15 years difference, and if you just look at the colors, not regarding the countries, they are two very different circles, aren't they? Showing that actually the United States, being the superpower in education and being the top host country, has lost share in the past 15 years. Actually, last year they were doing a bit better because the last year data, or the year before data, confirmed the 6% loss. So they came up a little bit. But the loser is actually Europe. And I'm sorry you can't see that, so I just quickly quote that. United Kingdom and France was able to retain the positions, but Germany lost a third of its market share. Spain is out, I'm sorry to say Belgium is out. And well, the most important change is that we have a new educational power emerging, and that is China, who took 10% of the market share in about 6 years' time. Those are a bit bigger, but I actually told the information included in them. But the third trend I identified was the schematization, the organization nature of student mobility at national levels, and I gave a few examples. And just as importantly, at regional levels. Now, I quoted the European examples, but as you can see, there are a lot of American initiatives. Recently, the China Scholarship Council launched a major scheme. India, with the Global 30 Plan, an extensive scheme of mobility, also incoming mobility, not just outgoing. The Arab Emirates, New Zealand are all there with their massive scholarship programs. What we can see is also a kind of regionalization in the Asia-Pacific region, getting out regional scholarship schemes, also in South Africa. And the oldest and the largest ever regional scholarship program is the European program, the Erasmus Program, and I have to underline that the first regional program in the history of mobility. And we come back to that, of course. Now, the fourth important point I made was the commercialization, which is affecting, actually, the mobility actions. Now, the traditional model of education is bonum commune, meaning that the state provides education, it's the well-being, the public wealth, so to say. The state provides education for its citizen to ensure their well-being. That's the function of the state. Now, I think we in higher education can agree that this has been severely challenged in our times and is undergoing major changes. And there are a number of reasons for that. In some countries, there have been considerable capital investments in education, both private and public funds, and there is an expectation to have return on those investments. Also, in several regions of the world, particularly in Asia, India, and recently in Africa, there is a larger local demand than supply in terms of higher education provision, and there are also quality issues. Students don't find that quality of higher education that they can find, so to say, in the Western world. So there is, this creates a need for study abroad in those regions. Another reason is that since the 1980s, the state subsidies in higher education in many countries went down. It's actually decreasing, and consequently, higher education institutions have a need to generate income. And last but not least, in 1995, higher education became an exportable service. It's part of the General Agreement on Trading Services, and thus it's creating a significant market of several $billion. And this shows the business success of that side. Those are the numbers that were generated in the various countries in 2015. The USA leading $30 billion generated through international education, and they claim that that created an additional almost 400,000 jobs in the States. Well, we have France also there with $2.1 billion. I converted all the amounts into dollars to make them comparable. The data is published in a different ways. Now, the economic success in these cases is explicit. However, this raises concerns. How will this affect the future of education? Universities sense the business orientation in international mobility, and the International Association of Universities, having more than 600 members in about 180 countries, conducted a survey about 10 years ago, the outcome of which was that although 69% of the universities acknowledge the positive impact of mobilization and internationalization in higher education, 70% of them foresees considerable risks. The most significant risk being the commercialization of the educational programs. And they repeated this survey 8 years later, and they got the same outcome, confirming that the respondents considered education becoming a commercial product the biggest, the largest societal risk in our time. Therefore, it is highly important that Europe is not exclusively on that track, in my view. Now, along those four trends, let's see what kind of mobility strategies are present. Vincent Lancren identified four major strategies in mobilization. The first of them is the mutual understanding approach, which has its historic origin, And this strategy emphasizes the cooperation, mobility, exchanges, institutional partnerships, the academic, cultural, political, and social importance of mobility is emphasized in that strategy. And although earlier a couple of countries practiced this approach, going back as far as the 1950s, when they had a more beneficial attitude to mobility actions. Currently, it's basically the Erasmus program that embodies this type of approach in mobility strategy. And the second one is the skilled migration, which focuses on attracting a large number of talented students who are expected to contribute to the knowledge economy of the receiving country. And this is especially practiced in the context of aging society, trying to get skilled workforce in the long run. A number of European countries do that, including my country, no matter how small we are in the market. Canada is the big representative of that approach. The third approach, going parallel with the commercialization, is the revenue-generating approach, which takes the concept of higher education as an expert industry, and it is linked with massive marketing activities. While the fourth one is the capacity-building approach, basically practiced by the emerging countries who try to import the know-how perspective, aiming to satisfy the increasing demand for higher education, as I have mentioned before. So in the context of those strategies and trends, let's see what is the mobility strategy in Europe. And I can skip part of that slide because Sophia yesterday referred to the joint study programs and the pilot exchanges and the launch of Erasmus. She also talked about the Bologna Declaration, so to save time, I can skip that. But along those lines, coming closer to in the history, I would like to refer to the Lisbon strategy that she did not detail yesterday that much, which targeted to make Europe the most competitive and dynamic knowledge economy by 2010. And we don't go into details how far we got into that. But from an educational point of view, it also brought an important change. Following the focus on the intra-European mobility, the Lisbon strategy declared that Europe needs to open up and create cooperation with the region outside Europe based on mutual benefits. And it also targeted that Europe has to become a preferred destination for students and researchers from all over the world. In this sense, it is moving towards Sophia's original concept, if I understand that well, saying that it's not a European issue. It's mobility based on mutual benefit and trust. It's actually a global issue. So the Lisbon strategy, in my view, is going into that direction to some extent, at least the first steps. Now, then came the Leuven communiqué, which you remember set the target to have 20% of graduates to participate in international mobility by the time they're completing their university studies, followed by the modernization agenda, where a key role is dedicated to higher education internationalization, and it was soon followed by a mobility strategy, which is currently being implemented in the framework of Erasmus+. Now let's talk a little bit about the Erasmus program, which is in the heart of the European mobility strategy. Well, the inspiring force, and I can't avoid that, is not EU-centric, but rather cosmopolitan lady, Sofia Corradi, who focuses more on universal values of trust, mutual understanding, and peace. And based on the literature, I think she was motivated by a personal story dating back to 1958, when upon returning from an international mobility in the United States, her home university in Italy didn't want to recognize her studies at Columbia University. And the attitude then was that a student should not go to study abroad. If Italian students go abroad to study, they will pollute the culture we live in. And this is a quotation from one of Sophia's publications. So which made her, I guess, to change this attitude through building trust among institutions and ultimately among people. And we understood it was a long way until the initiative landed on the table of the European Commission. And it took another 18 months for the European Commission to debate on the construction, basically for financial reasons. But finally, the program was launched in 1987, based on tuition waiver and on mutual recognition of studies completed. In that year, education had 10 times more allocation in the budget of the European Commission than earlier. And it seems that the investment was fruitful because this year Erasmus is celebrating its 30th anniversary. Now, what are the objectives in sum? They are very similar, actually, to the previously established mobility schemes at national level, but they are extended. Namely, gaining international experience, creating opportunities to develop professional, cultural, and language competencies, supporting cooperation among European higher education, meeting various cultures and facilitating their better understanding. And we also see an expansion in the mobility types, not just students, but gradually faculty and administrative staff, and also an expansion geographically. More and more countries are involved in the program. Let's see briefly how it was implemented. I don't think that the years are that much important, but Erasmus started as an individual program. It was integrated first to Socrates I, then to Socrates II. Then afterwards, it continued as part of the lifelong learning program, and now it's one of the elements of the Erasmus Plus program. To me, it says that the Erasmus Mobility Program has been a constant and stable component of all higher education strategies in the European Union. Regardless of any structural changes, it preserved its central role in the strategy and it justifies its importance. Some slides about the results, which might be some of them might be familiar to you. This shows the dynamic growth in the participating students number. We heard yesterday that it's actually over 4 million and the 300,000 students per year. What is probably more novelty to you is this slide. And now I would like you to remember the slide I showed you about the global mobility, having the increasing numbers in students number and the stagnating 2% participation globally in mobility. Now in Europe, this is what you see. We have the growing number in the students, and the orange line shows how dynamically the Erasmus mobility participation grows. This is a percentage. So obviously at the beginning it was 0.03. Now it's close to 2% of all the students in Europe. So actually the Erasmus mobility scheme shows a much more dynamic growth than the global mobility in the past 30 years. This substantiates that the same applies to the faculty and the administrative staff mobility. You can see how not that steeply as the students' number, but how steadily they actually grow throughout the years. This shows the growth in the participating higher education organizations. Currently, we have 5,000 universities participating in the Erasmus Mobility Scheme. And this diagram does not show any growth. It shows stability. It's the representation of the various study fields. It's a bit surprising how steady it has been. There's no change. Coming from the top to the down, social sciences are the most represented, humanities, engineering, natural sciences, health sciences. And the bottom of the column is education. I am dedicated to make a separate research on that because I'm very disappointed. Obviously, you have to see that in percentage, what percentage of students in education are involved, and it's very hard to get data at a European level that how many students do we have in teacher training in Europe and in the various fields, but I'm working on that. The Erasmus budget. I show this chart to illustrate that money is not everything in that. Just to point out that obviously it's growing, more and more money is dedicated, and it's very good that it is like that. But, for example, between 1993 and 1995, and I apologize, you can't see that, you have to trust what I say, the program budget was increased by approximately 1% annually. In that period, the participation increased by 15 to 17%. Also, in 1996, when there was a decrease of 6% in the budget, but that was felt in the participation that also dropped to some extent. But then in 1999, when additional 10 countries joined and the budget was increased by 40%, the actual increase was not that much. So finance is important, but apart from finances, there are other factors affecting the mobility, the interest in the program. The European mobility strategy has further elements, and I understand I have to be very brief on those. We had the Tempus program that focused on the neighboring countries of the EU, financing approximately 7,000 different projects, including mobility actions, until it was alive. And we have Erasmus Mundus from 2004 and still going on. To date, it has financed 20,000 students from 180 countries to participate in joint master and doctoral degrees in Europe. So I would like to highlight in sum that the Erasmus Mobility Scheme covers about 7% of the total mobility in the world, which doesn't look like a big number, but it's a big number. Within Europe, it is estimated to be around 30 to 40% of all mobility actions. And there are different data on that, and I was not able to decide which one to trust. So it's either somewhere between 30 and 40, and I have to work a little bit more on that to make the data more precise. What is the advantage? What is the essence of the Erasmus program? It is based on institutional collaboration and contracts. It deepens the interinstitutional relations based on functioning via planning and as part of a strategy, as opposed to individual ad hoc initiatives. Through financial support it provides, the program ensures access to socially disadvantaged students, and I would like to highlight that point as one of the main value of the program. And increasingly, the quality issues are getting emphatic. So there is a selection. It starts to be a merit-based selection who can participate in the program. time. So in conclusion, what I can tell you is that all components of higher education today is mobile. The arena of international mobility has recently undergone 4 major changes: massification, globalization, the scheme-based nature, and commercialization. And there is a national need to adjust the higher education strategies accordingly, and there is a European need to consider those trends in the global mobility market. While the cross-border mobility globally is not expanding as forecast, due to the emergence of local highs in higher educations in the emerging countries, Erasmus shows an expanding nature at a much higher rate than the global mobility. Therefore, it is essential that the value of this mutually beneficial approach is considered, it's maintained, it stays part of the internationalization strategies at European level. And while Europe has no jurisdiction on education, just like in other aspects quoted yesterday, it is essential that Europe supports the nations in their efforts to build relations for mutual benefits, to find solutions for mutual problems, build trust and find better understanding among each other to pave the way for a better world. Thank you for your attention.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Edith, for offering us this wide framework of the mobility actions and training programs. I believe all the audience has enjoyed one or another European program, Erasmus, Socrates, etc. And we all have that experience that is being given to us as younger students. It's good to have the doors open to be able to participate in this. And we were mentioning this with Sophia and with Edith this morning, the great view of monks that goes through the mind, but also through the body, through the living experiences, the relations with the others, with families. It is a relationship with reality which for many educators who had present a pedagogical model which was more modern and not in mere memorization of written words, but with direct contact with reality, was not unknown to them. In Spain, we have had that tradition of the freedom of learning institution where educators were sent to France and Germany and to bring that to our entrenched society. It was a privilege in those days, and it is a clear privilege right now. Edith, has said it very clearly, the social version of aid to people in a situation of disadvantage. I wouldn't say of poverty, but that require additional aid. And this is something we refer to when we speak of equal opportunities, to give the conditions of possibility so that everybody can develop. Otherwise, we could fall into the mistake of thinking that only some who succeed are successful because they have worked a lot. I don't think this is true. There are very valuable people who have great potential. Jairo spoke of this. that if we don't transform into action, will stay there. There is a lot of gifts in young people that can only be developed if they have opportunities like these grants that allow us to participate in this privilege, because it is a privilege to be able to learn in Europe. I'm sure you will have a lot of questions for Edith. We will open the round of debates. It doesn't need to be questions. You can make comments or contributions you wish to make on these programs.
Muy bien, aquí hay una mano. Perfecto.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. So you talked about higher education becoming a commercial product, and I would like to know if there are ways to avoid that higher education actually becomes a commercial product. I think that in Spain, prices, well, tuition fees have increased in the recent years. So maybe it is part of this trend. And on the other hand, in France, public universities have very low tuition fees, including for international students and non-EU international students, which is, on the one hand, very good because international students are not selected depending on their resources, because, well, since the tuition fees are very low and the same fees apply, well, they can attract people from all over the world. But on the other hand, I know that some universities complain about this because the tuition fees are established by the French authorities, not by the universities themselves. So what do you think about this, and do you think that this is one way of avoiding commercialization of higher education? Thank you.
I think I have the bad news that higher education has been commercialized, so that we cannot say that it's not and we can stop it. It's the fact. We have to face that. As I said, education is a national issue. It's no interference with that at European level, so each country can decide what they do with their higher education, with their education as such. France is a very interesting example. They are the ones in Europe that invest the most in higher education. That's why they can keep the fees lower. And they really have this open gate, trying to attract more and more students. They do generate quite some money with that, but actually when you analyze their international education policy, it's not their priority to generate money through that. That's what they claim, at least. Still, they do. To give another example, the Nordic countries started out with zero fee for international students. A couple of years back, they all changed and they started to raise the fee. Now Sweden, they all time come here and study with us, now have higher fees for international students than for their local students. So there is a tendency in Europe to go towards commercialization. I'm sorry, I was got a bit concentrated for my last slide. What I wanted to emphasize as a conclusion is that the importance of Erasmus and the EU level internationalization is to actually counterbalance these commercialization trends, which are there. We cannot close our eyes. They are there, but the EU has the tool to counterbalance it and moving towards a little bit more to the mutual understanding, the mutual benefits of I put in what I have, you put in what you have, and the two of us make three in the end. So this type of attitude. And after all, if you think of that and philosophy-oriented students might join in that, we live in a global world, and the issues we have are global issues, and we need to find global solutions. And I see the role of the mobility in that to to be the most important one. It's, of course, it's building trust and international relations, but the ultimate goal is to produce something that make our life better. So no way to stop, in my view. I might be pessimistic, but we are too far down on the road in commercialization. And that's why I quoted this bonum commune aspect, because I think the world lost a lot by giving this concept up.
Here is the question.
If you don't mind, I'm going to ask you in Spanish.
Sure.
Okay.
Do you think that the Bologna program has contributed in a positive manner to the Erasmus program? Because in some countries, it has been difficult to implement the Bologna program in the educational system.
I cannot hear the translation, but it will be okay now. Sorry.
Oh, no, no problem.
Do you think that the Bologna program or plan has or facilitates the results or is positive for the Erasmus program? I am asking you this because there has been in Spain some problems in its implementation in the educational system, and although it may be beneficial to accredit the diplomas, and part of the essence of the Erasmus program is lost because when it has been homogeneized the program, it is lost part of the specific form in which education is applied in each country. So apart from implementation of Bologna process, how does the Bologna process affect the Erasmus program in the different views of educating in the different member states of the European Union?
In terms of mobility, Bologna process helps a lot. But if we separate it from the mobility, Bologna process creates a lot of issues in most of the countries I researched. There was no smooth transition from the national system to Bologna system. Do we have Bologna experts in the group? I have to be highly critical of that. It was an excellent initiative. The higher education systems in Europe, it's very fragmentary. Each country had its own system. It was absolutely not comparable. The idea was to create the European higher educational area. I have never read that written down, but my personal view is that the need for that was really among a lot of nice reasons to counterbalance the hegemony of the American, the United States as an educational power. And when I quoted the Lisbon strategy, it clearly says that we would like not the United States, which is currently the #1 host country, we would like Europe to be the #1 host region for the international students. So the idea was good, was understandable. So to say, let's not make a judgment on that. But I understand the concept of the Bologna process. It brought a lot of benefits. It definitely supported the Erasmus mobility, because if the systems are comparable, then the mobility can be more efficient. It's not just a visit. You can take your credit back. But in reality, I saw problems with the implementation being too quick. In many countries, I don't dare to say Germany, but I heard problems there. Definitely in my country. Huge resistance from the universities. A couple of countries, and I would not like to name them, did that very superficially. Okay. We call that a Bologna structure, but when you investigate that, it was on the surface. You scratch that, it's not a real 3+2+4 3-cycle system. or not in the same sense as it is declared in the documents. So I think that the Bologna had its advantages and disadvantages. You pointed out a very important point, the homogenization of education, which has been discussed in many studies, not only regarding the European higher education, but the global higher education, because with the branch campuses, you do the same thing. You homogenize. You take the flavor of the local higher education away and you impose your own system on them. So we are moving towards a homogenization, and through that along that road, we lose treasures, I'm sure. I wouldn't dare to measure the balance of gains and losses on this road.
It's not working, the microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
I have one or two remarks or questions. First, I think commercialization is a good concept, and certainly in some countries, universities need some additional resource, and Erasmus or mobility is for them a way to get them first. Secondly, I think in the economic field, the notion of economic competitivity and national economic competitivity is very important, because in the Lisbon strategy you had the global economic and competitivity of Europe, but the national state translated it in national economic competitivity. So I think if you want to look at the economic dimension, you have to take this in account. So you have a competition between national policies to attract good students, for instance, and they are ready to give money for this. So that's one remark. Secondly, you speak about globalization and internationalization. I ask myself if the good concept, according to your paper, is international massification more than globalization. Because if you hear your paper, it's always national strategy, national developments, comparison between national statistics. So I ask myself, what is it? Is it globalization or massification, international massification? That's a question. I think it's the second one.
Okay. First about commercialization. Many experts of the field argues that commercialization made a good impact on education in terms of quality. The fact that you ask money for the education that you provide, you know, it's got its market rules. You have to provide quality, you have to provide a good product, otherwise in the long run you won't get your customers, your clients. And we can admit that in many countries it contributed to raise the quality of higher education. So it has a good impact on the national higher education. Even if we don't take commercialization, just the pure mutually beneficial internationalization, it forces you, and this is the second part of my research, it forces you to provide international services, it forces you to provide international courses which are accessible to your own national students. So your students are able to take classes in English. Prior to the mobility schemes, that was not an urge on the part of the university to provide those. And that has been actually fortified by the commercialization, because they figured out, okay, I can sell this course at a good price. If I make it better, I can charge even more, and I get even more students. So I don't I don't protest, I don't question the positive impact of commercialization, but I'm more on the conservative side, saying that education as such cannot be purely provided through market rules. So it's the economic market has the rules of the economic market cannot be transferred directly to higher education, because I think education functions in a little bit different way than selling mobile phones on the market. Mobile phones are very important, but I think education has a different nature. Now, globalization, internationalization, and massification. I actually, for massification, I quoted global data, not national data. And what I was trying to point out, that the world is globalizing, and higher education is lagging behind in that sense. Higher education has not been globalizing together with the economy. There is a later stage of globalization. And within the context of higher education, when we refer to globalization, we speak about internationalization. Okay? I'm sorry if it was not very clear.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting for me, especially since I am from Hungary as well, and I teach at a university in Hungary where I teach in the English language program of international relations. So my class consists mainly of Erasmus students and international students. So I experience this international atmosphere constantly through my class, and the exchange of ideas it's great how a Hungarian student communicates with students from all over Europe and the world. But my question is, I don't know if you've considered it in your research, what's your opinion about online education? Because online, in an era of globalization, we have great things like Erasmus doesn't know borders. It's a transnational idea that it crosses borders, but so does the internet. So can an internet education offer the level of higher education that's expected? Is that a direction we want to take? Does that increase or decrease the number of students applying to study abroad because they can just get online? And even Harvard University provides online programs these days. And
free of charge.
Free of charge.
MIT, the same.
MIT,
yeah.
yes, and also other European universities. Our university is thinking about doing something. And there's also the question of degree mills, if those degrees are worth anything. So what's your opinion about the impact of online education and internationalization of education and globalization?
Through online internationalization of
exactly.
education. Well, this is a very...
It's mobility in a different form. It's like cyber mobility.
Well, we call that virtual mobility.
Virtual mobility, right.
It's an existing phenomenon, of course. What you're asking is quite complex because you touched quality issues, so I try to separate them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, online education as such, I wouldn't like to judge that in terms of the quality of the education, mm-hmm. because that's a different issue. In terms of internationalization, I do touch upon that in my dissertation, with regard to a relative new phenomenon called the internationalization at home, which is partially about online education and partially about receiving students, thus creating an international environment at our own university. So our students are exposed to different cultures through the incoming students. So this is one part of internationalization. And the other component of that is the online education. They can go online and take courses of other universities. And you quoted American examples, but actually Europe is doing quite a lot on that in the MOOCs. Well. And Sophia yesterday referred to possibilities for projects to be submitted and apply for money. Mm-hmm. We have an increased budget. And actually, MOOCs are highly supported in several initiatives. You can get quite nice sums of money with a good project if you want to develop MOOCs, the massive online courses. Online education is part of internationalization, part of the internationalization at home, which I personally think is not the same as the real mobility. It would never substitute that, exactly for the reasons that Sophia quoted yesterday, the gaining the experience, the interpersonal skills, the language competencies. I didn't have time to go into details of the impact of the mobility, but among them, the various skills and competencies are highlighted, like problem solving. If you attend an online course, what kind of problem solving are you exposed to? To some, but not the same extent. Decision making. You are all on your own in a different culture. You have to make a decision on things. Communication. I think communication is highly lost in the online education because online communication is a different type of communication. I might be a bit conservative, so the younger generation, please attack me, challenge me on that. But so it's there, it's present, it's being used by quite a few students. It's very helpful for those who cannot afford, because let's be honest, the Erasmus scholarship in most of the cases does not cover the full cost of a mobility. And there is still a layer of students who cannot afford to go abroad, even with the help of Erasmus. So for those, and for those who are not ready to be mobile, there are quite a few students who are not ready to leave their country for various reasons. Interestingly enough, there are more young men among them than young girls. So probably the mama hotel phenomenon is there. Sorry, guys. So it's useful for them who wouldn't be mobile anyway. But those who can move, who can participate in a real cross-border mobility, it's not a substitute.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation.
I can see you.
My question is related to what you just said about resources. As I saw in the data that you showed at the beginning that there was a little decrease between 2013 and 2014 of people going abroad. I mean, the line was increasing, but then in this range of, in this period, there was a little decrease. So my question is, do you know why there is this decrease? Because maybe the economic crisis is affecting the possibility of going abroad, or maybe, I don't know, there is a new trend for international students to just enroll directly in a foreign university. For example, in the Netherlands, as the fees are very low compared to the UK, there are many English students that go to study abroad, and as I understood, they are not counted as mobility students. They are
not counted as Erasmus mobility, but
yeah,
if a UK student goes to study in the Netherlands, crosses the borders, it's a mobility. Okay. It's taken by World Bank, by OECD.
So my question is, how would you explain this little decrease in the last period?
Yes, you have a very good eye. Not because the screen was not good, but you sense something very important. Actually, in 2012, a decreasing process started all over. Another problem with the data is that they come very slowly, and the European Union is the slowest among all. So that's why I had to stop at 2014, because claiming that Erasmus program now can last for 2 years at the universities, they apply for a 2-year period and distribute the stipends to students annually or by the semester, but they report after 2 years. So the program starting in 2014 is being reported in 2017. So when I prepared those, the data was not available. But we know that from 2012, there is a slight decrease in the mobilities all over the world. The highest number was 2012, when we had 4.5 million students, and I quoted only 4.1, so that is like 10% less. The literature does not discuss your question. I had the same question, so I really started to go into that direction, because after, you know, the study move, what happened in 2012, and even in my country, Hungary, very specifically 2012, the trend starts to drop. So the literature is not very extensive on that. They do quote the later coming effect of the economic crisis, but I would say that did it take 4 years? I mean, it's not, to me, it doesn't explain the whole thing. So I don't have an answer to you, but I'm on it. So if I find something, I will definitely put it in and publish, share it with other people.
Probably it's just something physiological. It's normal. It's not a big decrease. It's a slight decrease. So maybe it's something physiological, or maybe
we have
new
to see it in the long run, how long it lasts, how
Exactly.
steep it goes. So it's probably too early to identify a tendency in that. But it's interesting that what happened there, because I searched several countries, and 2012 something happened in the countries because they started to have less students on the move.
Edith, so far we've looked at student mobility as a value per se, and I don't have any doubts that it has one. But the question is, do we have reliable data on the impact of mobility on the individual students? What kind of impact there is?
The European Union published at least 4 different studies on that. I have to say I studied them. They are not univocal. Not all of them points out the same values. A couple of them points out employability as number 1. And there are statistics that those fresh graduates who participated in Erasmus Mobility have 20% better chances to be employed in the area where they would like to work, and that is important, so that not that they are employed as bakers, but in the area where they want to work, in their area of interest. Now, some statistics attack that, so it's not fully underpinned, but I definitely see a benefit there. And then there is a list of top competences that students themselves identify as a benefit of their being abroad. And those are the intercultural language, problem solving, decision making, independency. Motivation is interesting that because they are motivated, they feel that this motivation helped them to develop their social skills, meta language, intercultural communication. So basically the 4 top ones I quoted, and there are a lot minor ones that they quote. These are measured through massive surveys, like they have almost 40,000 students surveyed at a time, and then they compile this list. So competence development and employability are very much confirmed as positive benefits.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Sofia Corral.
I had asked to say something when we were speaking. of distant education. First of all, I wish to thank for this excellent report. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to ask you to point out with evidence, if you ever are going to speak, to write specifically on this issue, that one important element, I would say a very, very important element of physical mobility of the student is the experience of being a minority. Mm-hmm. Just consider what sconvolgente. It really makes you think a lot, it forces you to change your behavior. The experience of being a minority, even in trivial things, as being in the students' cafeteria and having to choose whether you eat meat with potatoes or with bread. Just to give you the most trivial example. And this has been discussed. I had to discuss this in the earlier years. I am referring to 1969. But why couldn't we mobilize professors? You know, no. One of the very important experience was to be a minority. About the reports, I wouldn't dare to write it down somewhere because I have no evidence for it. But you will agree that you cannot measure the success of a life or of a large initiative on the success of the person in profession. It has been said, not totally known, but success in the profession is not the measure of success of a life. And I feel that when I read those reports commissioned and paid by the European Union, and they tell you that it increases employability, well, I would prefer to be more precise. Whether does it increase happiness of the person? Mm-hmm. Does it increase the peace in the world? But in general, I would be very careful in giving so much importance to employability. And I have interviewed the only people who really measure employability, that is, employers. And what they constantly tell me is that by hiring an Erasmus student, they don't hire a better engineer, a better legal expert. They hire somebody who sometimes, despite the fact that he does not speak English, despite the fact that he is competent in other fields, but he is successful in dealing with people coming from another culture. I don't have a conclusion, but I think we should just keep this in mind. Thank you again for your excellent report.
Thank you. Just to reflect quickly on the minority question, this is definitely not in the top 10 question. Actually, it's not included in the questionnaires of the surveys. I processed about 1,100 and something questionnaires that were filled in with Erasmus mobility participants. So I went through the questionnaires provided by the EU for them in different aspects, and minority is not included as a question, I have to say. So we should probably put that on the table.
May I say, of course.
Yeah.
May I say, of course.
So that is a very interesting aspect, and I have to admit that I haven't dealt with that in my dissertation. It's not part of any of the surveys so far I know. And there was another thing I wanted to say for the second part, the employability. Yes, this is why I said that a couple of reports emphasize that. A couple of them attack this 20%. But what you were saying, I think, is very important from an educational point of view and employability point of view, is that in the 21st century, education starts to be competence-based, and the employability side takes that. So they don't take young students knowing a lot about engineering, because engineering is so much specified that they learn what they have to know related to their jobs, on the job. But they try to find people with good competencies. And I think in this respect, mobility, Erasmus mobility, adds to their competence development. So they might not be better engineers after an Erasmus mobility. Some university says that they are probably worse because they lose half a year from their traditional education. But in terms of competences, they might be better off. Do you disagree to that?
I disagree. Because I run into employers telling me stories that they give specific tasks for somebody who does not have the competences. But if he has been on Erasmus, he will either learn very quickly or be successful immediately, which I consider a very precious thing.
I think we are talking about the same thing. There's no disagreement on that.
Okay.
Okay.
Muy bien, estamos ya realmente.
We are running a bit behind, but I would like to add to what Sofia Corradi said. As she said, education, regardless of what the PISA report says, that we want to train competent, competent professionals. Besides competence and having entrepreneurs, that is what universities are all for, because there are many business schools everywhere. They're growing like mushrooms. We need to remind ourselves that it's not just about being competitive. We need to recognize the capacity of the other. And I love that idea of filling a minority, because filling a minority abroad and knowing how to live together with others and understand from zero what conviviality means, and that is essential. And I think that we need not just to measure the success degree based on employability, but to see what that profession means among all the complex life that belongs to each human being. Thank you very much, Edith, for your extraordinary conference.